Now let's start manipulating objects. We're going to work with the Move tool first. Now the Move tool can be found here in the toolbox. But before we go any further, I want to explain some important hotkeys for Maya. Now these are in the top left-hand corner of the keyboard. They are Q, W, E, and R. Now when you press them, Q selects the selection tool, which we've seen before. W selects move, E selects rotate, and R selects scale. So if you learn to position your hand up on that top left corner of the keyboard, you can do Q, W, E, and R very, very quickly. And it's a great way to work in Maya. It really allows you to move very quickly between move, rotate, scale, and select. Now we're going to look at move. So I'm going to hit W to go into the move tool. And when we do, we can select an object just like we select using the select tool. So I can just left click on any object in the scene and it will select. Now, when we select an object, this little icon comes up, and this is our Move tool. Now, we have all of our axes here represented by arrows. So I have red for X, green for Y, and blue for Z. So XYZ equals RGB. And if we want to, I can move it along the x-axis by selecting the red axis. The green axis moves it up and down along Y. The blue axis moves it back and forth along Z. Now, there are times when you will need to move it along multiple axes, so you can just highlight the center here and you can move it wherever you want. Now, doing this in the 3D view probably isn't that wise because it's not really that accurate. If I go into an orthographic viewport by hitting my space bar or selecting my quad view panel layout, you can see that I can actually go into, say, a top view. And when I go into the top view and select that center portion, it actually restricts the motion to only those axes that you have in the top view, in this case, X and Z. So we're not going to be moving it in Y. This is a great way to move an object, say, along the floor or something like that. Now, an even easier way to do that is to go back into our perspective window and just go ahead and select any one of these little squares. If you can see them here, we've got a blue, a red, and a green square. And those are really representative of the axes which we're moving perpendicular to. So if I select the green one, that means I'm not going to move it in Y. And so that basically is the same as moving it along the floor. The red one moves it in a plane that is perpendicular to X, and the blue moves it perpendicular to Z. Now, once we understand this move tool, we can use it to move multiple objects, and so we can select multiple objects just the same way we use in the select tool. So if I hold down my shift key, I can select multiple objects here, and I can move those and rearrange them however I want. And just like with the select tool, I can shift deselect an object and just move the remaining objects. Now, another thing that's really important is the axes that we're moving along. If I double click on my move tool, you'll see I get the tool settings. Another way to do this is to click on this little button here. But once we get this window open, you'll see that we have a number of options for this. And probably one of the most important ones is this one at the very top, and it's called Axis Orientation. By default, this is set to world space. So anything that we move is going to be aligned to the world axes. And you can see them down here in the bottom left-hand corner of your viewport. So as you can see, the X, Y, and Z axes here match up with these X, Y, and Z axes. But we can also change that. So if we don't want to align our move tool to the world, we can align it to any other type of object. Probably the most important one is the object itself. So instead of aligning to the world, we're aligning to the object's own internal coordinate system. So in this case, notice how this changes a little bit. But if we select one of these chairs that's at an angle, notice how the axis turns. So if I go from world view, it's aligned to the world. And here in object, it's aligned to the object. So this object has actually been rotated by about 45 degrees. And so the axes actually follow along with that rotation. So now if I want to move it directly forward and backward, I can, and it makes it much easier. So it's much easier to push this chair in using object orientation rather than world. So if I wanted to do the same thing in world orientation, I'd have to kind of figure it out by moving it at an angle. But if I do object, then it's much easier. Now, aligning these axes to an object is a whole other topic, and I will get to that in just a bit. Now, another thing that the Move Tool settings has is a soft selection. Now, this actually is available to really any of the major tools. So Select, Move, Rotate, and Scale all have soft selection. Now, if I click this on, you'll see that we have a number of options here. So the first two, volume and surface, are for modeling. So they're actually for changing the shape of the object itself. Now we're dealing with whole objects, so we're going to focus more on global and objects. So if I select, say, this chair and turn on object, and I want to make sure my fall off radius is fairly high, let's say about 400, then notice what happens. I'm going to go ahead and change my orientation back to world. And let's go ahead and just move this along the y-axis. And notice how this is moving everything kind of proportionally. But it's kind of leaving behind this one on the left here. So if we wanted to, we could dial up our fall-off radius just a little bit. And notice how these change color. So orange and yellow mean that they're going to be more affected, and then red means a little bit less affected. In fact, you can see that that color scheme is right here if we scroll down just a little bit. So as I move these, you can see I can move these proportionally. Now, if we want, we can go into global mode, and that actually digs down into the shape of the objects themselves. So as I move this, notice how the objects start to stretch and distort. Now, typically, if we're moving whole objects, that's probably not something we want to do, but if we're doing some special effects, that might be something that would work. So now one of the things is that when I use soft selection, a lot of times I'll click off and I'll go do something else, and this will remain selected. So I always like to get in the habit of clicking it off when I don't need it, because you'll come back to the Move tool and all of a sudden soft select will be on and things won't behave the way you want. So just get in the habit of turning that off. So those are some of the ways to select and move objects in Maya.